On March 26, 2010, a South Korean corvette, or the ROKS Cheonan, was sunk by the torpedo launched from a North Korean submarine. This was the moment that the 6-year conflict between South and North Korea rose its ugly head. The sinking of Cheonan tells more than just a conflict between two hostile nations. It also tells the usefulness of submarines as a weapon for the weak, typical difficulties in the anti-submarine warfare, and how the absence of assurance of retaliation emboldens your enemy. After all, it is the most recent and one of rare submarine attacks in the naval history since 1945. The attack will be told from two different perspectives. The North Korean perspective first, then the South Korean perspective. So, this is Sinking of Cheonan, Part 1, the North Korean perspective. Despite the ceasefire of the Korean War in 1953, the inter-Korean relation has been tarnished by numerous military conflict. In the last 2 decades, the conflict have revolved around the Northern Limit Line, or the NLL, the de facto maritime border set by the United Nations Command after the war. While South Korea held on to this line, North Korea declared their own borderline, which is located far closer to the south. From the late 1990s, the disputes developed into naval battles. The first 2 battles occurred off the western coast of Yeonpyeong Island, and thus they are called Battles of Yeonpyeong Sea. In the first battle, the South Korean Navy accomplished a total victory, sinking 1 North Korean torpedo boat, severely damaging 5 other ships, and killing 20 to 30 men. The South Korean losses were light. No ship was sunk, 5 ships were slightly damaged, and no one was killed. North Korea retaliated 3 years later, almost exactly where they were defeated last time. In the second battle of Yeonpyeong Sea, North Korea managed to sink 1 South Korean patrol boat and killed 6 men. North Korea had at least 13 men killed. These battles contributed to the enormous hatred and yearning for vengeance between the South Korean and North Korean Navy. Since the second battle of Yeonpyeong Sea, it seemed that brief peace had been settled. However, another engagement rattled the hiatus on November 11, 2009, when a North Korean gunboat intruded the NLL off the eastern coast of Daecheon Island. Initially, the gunboat was pursuing a Chinese trawler which had been fishing in the North Korean water and then changed its course to the south. The gunboat crossed the NLL following the Chinese boat. The South Koreans immediately warned the intruder, and when 3 rounds of warning shots were fired, the North Koreans returned fire, directly targeting South Korean vessels. But the obsolete gunboat was no match for a numerically and technologically superior enemy. 6 South Korean warships, including 4 patrol boats, 1 corvette, and 1 frigate, fired as many as 5,000 shells at the small vessel of some 150 tons. The ship was severely damaged and barely managed to escape. In this battle, known as the Battle of Daecheon Sea, North Korea lost at least 8 men, while the South suffered no casualty at all. North Korea became furious after the defeat, as they revenged their defeat in the first battle of Yeonpyeong Sea. So the second battle 3 years later, North Korea once again must strike back. The biggest problem, however, was how. Retaliating with another surface engagement was likely to fail. Given the past surface engagement, 2 things were clear. First, South Korea, with their superior economic power, had more operational warships. In the past 3 battles, the North Korean Navy had to face up to 6 times numerically superior enemy. Also, while North Korean naval guns were manually operated, South Korean counterparts were fully automated and guided by accurate fire control system. The accuracy between 2 was incomparable. This is why North Korea lost more men than the South did, even in the second battle of Yeonpyeong Sea, which is usually considered to be North Korean victory. Perhaps the handiest retaliatory option for North Korea was to use her geographical advantage. The NLL is closer to the North Korean coast than it is to South Korean mainland. This means the South Korean warships often had to operate within the range of North Korean artillery batteries and surface-to-sea missiles. If North Korea managed to strike South Korean vessels with her missiles, then she will easily make up for the last defeat without risking the lives of their men and vessels in a precarious surface engagement. However, the problem was that no South Korean warships now operated within the range of these weapons. On November 15th, or 5 days after the Battle of Daecheon Sea, North Korean missile and artillery sites directed their tracking radar at South Korean vessels. The South Koreans immediately retreated in full speed. And ever since, South Korea had very hardly exposed her vessels to North Korean radar detection, except for small patrol boats, which were too small to be distinguished by the obsolete North Korean KN-1 missiles. It was clear that South Korea redeployed their relatively large and vulnerable vessels to outside the range of North Korean detection. With no sign of South Korean ships returning, the prospect of using surface-to-sea missiles was now gone. Another retaliatory option was a much bolder one. It was to strike a South Korean warship with submarine. In the early stage of planning, the North Koreans were skeptical, because the Yellow Sea is notoriously unfavorable water for submarine operation. To start with, it has shallow water. Its average water depth is only some 140 feet, and much of South Korean coastal water is inaccessible by submarine due to the shallowness. The shallow water also means that submarines cannot utilize water depth for evasive maneuver and to stay undetected. Secondly, this sea is full of fishing nets. They pose a significant threat to submarine operation. In fact, the North Koreans had the first-hand experience in this regard. In 1998, a Yugo-class North Korean submarine was trapped in a fishing net when infiltrating into South Korean shore. Her screw was completely jammed and she was soon surrounded by the South Korean troops. As the submarine was being towed to the nearest port by the South Koreans, all 9 crews inside the ship ended up killing themselves. As much as North Korea was eager for revenge, she also didn't want to repeat that mistake. In the Yellow Sea, Chinese trawlers frequently operate around the NLL, capitalizing on the fact that both South and North Koreans refrained from getting too close to the line, fearing possible conflict. In effect, a Chinese trawler crossing the line was what triggered the previous Battle of Daecheon Sea. Anyway, the point here is that the NLL and its adjacent water must be avoided for the bold operation to succeed. However, inversely speaking, this is exactly why the submarine attack in the Yellow Sea may work. Both North and South Korea were aware of the difficulties of submarine operation in the Yellow Sea. North Korea had placed 2/3 of their submarines at the East Sea, where water is much deeper and favorable to underwater operation, and only 1/3 at the Yellow Sea. In response, South Korea has stressed differing qualities to their regional fleet. The first fleet in the East Sea was known to have the best anti-submarine capabilities in the country, while the second fleet in the Yellow Sea excelled at surface engagement. Overall, the second fleet lacked sufficient training and equipment for anti-submarine warfare. So if North Korea somehow managed to overcome the odds in the Yellow Sea, then she will most likely strike where the enemy is most vulnerable. After all, submarine operation in the Yellow Sea was difficult, but not impossible. North Korea overcame the underwater environment of the Yellow Sea by moving through and staying in relatively deep water, and by bypassing the fishing areas. This point will be dealt in detail later. On the other hand, there was also a bigger problem to be reckoned with. The past naval engagement were basically gunfight with no missile or torpedo used. This was an implicit agreement between South and North Korea to prevent the possible escalation into a total war. Unlike surface vessels, which can be used for both low-intensity and high-intensity missions, submarines are the inflexible weapon system designed only for high-intensity engagement. A single heavyweight torpedo from submarine will surely break any corvette or frigate in half. If successful, the submarine attack will break the previous tacit agreement for de-escalation and may lead to a full-scale war that no one wanted. The North Koreans evaluated such possibility, and at the end came to the conclusion that a submarine attack would not lead to a war. Since the end of the Korean War, South Korea has adopted very defensive and restrictive rules of engagement and national defense policy in general. Despite the continuous North Korean attacks, South Korea had very heartily showed her determination for retaliation in return. Even when it was their clear and miserable defeat, South Korea did not retaliate. These past behaviors of South Korea gave the North an assurance that she will not suffer any military retaliation whatsoever, even if she managed to sink a South Korean warship. The worst loss for North Korea from this operation was to lose their submarine in action and nothing more. If it was the escalation below the threshold of war, then it was clearly better than holding on to the low-intensity fight that North Korea could not win. The South Korean fleet composition defending the NLL needs to be explained here. The first was small and agile patrol boats. They acted as sentries in the front line. They guarded the borderline at a close distance, and they were the first South Korean assets to face if North Korea were to cross the line. The second force was corvettes and frigates. They acted as quick reaction force. They usually operated at some distance from the line to evade anti-ship missile threats. But whenever a surface engagement occurred, they maneuvered in full speed and gave fire support to the patrol boats ahead of them. All these warships were under the command of the Second Fleet. But these warships had little anti-submarine capabilities. The corvettes and frigates had no helipad or hangar to store an anti-submarine helicopter, and their only sonar was made with the 1980s technology, which had mediocre performance at best, even by the contemporary standard. And the patrol boat? Forget about them, they had no sonar system at all. The reason behind their poor anti-submarine capacity was because their design philosophy was to overpower North Korean warships in naval gunfight. If North Korea were to strike, then she must strike these vulnerable warships in the front. At the same time, North Korea knew that additional South Korean assets were often dispatched to assist the Second Fleet. The most common reinforcement were destroyers. They were modern warships to be reckoned with. They had decent sonar system and could carry an anti-submarine helicopter with them. The presence of these destroyers in the nearby water will jeopardize the submarine operation. However, North Korea also knew that the destroyers were merely additional assets, meaning that they were not under the command of the Second Fleet, but the Fleet Command in Busan. Whenever the Fleet Command believed the imminent threat were no longer present, they returned to their port, leaving the Second Fleet to rely on their own strengths. In theory, the biggest threat to any submarine operation will come from maritime patrol aircraft. They can cover a wide range of areas with their long endurance and high speed. Most importantly, they are one of few anti-submarine platforms that can freely use active sonar system. Active sonar emits artificial sound pulses to detect underwater objects, meaning that the detection is not hampered by the object's sound level. It is well suited for detecting extremely quiet objects, such as submarines. The downside is that the created sound pulses will inform the nearby enemy of their location. The reason why surface vessels and submarines hardly employ it in real situations. Aircraft are free from such concern because even if their location is compromised, submarines have no means to attack flying aircraft. However, despite patrol aircraft's strong anti-submarine capabilities, they could not be fully utilized by the South Koreans. By 2009, South Korea had only 8 patrol aircraft to cover some 90,000 square miles. 8 planes mean that only 1 or 2 at most will be in the air for patrol mission at any given time. Furthermore, North Korea knew that South Korean patrol aircraft had very hardly operated close to the NLL. Much of each air was within the range of North Korean surface-to-air missiles and fighter cover. For patrol aircraft to operate in this area, they must be escorted by the friendly fighter jets. But North Korea knew that so far it had hardly been the case. It seemed that South Korea instead chose not to fly in this area. To North Korea, the most visible South Korean assets of nuisance were submarines. It is not because South Korean submarines had strong anti-submarine capabilities. So as of late 2009, South Korea had 12 submarines, among which only 3 had meaningful hunter-killer capability to track and attack enemy submarines. The rest were designed for basic anti-surface missions and lacked sufficient sonar system for anti-submarine warfare. Rather, the problem lay in uncertainty. In other words, North Korea had no way of knowing the location of South Korean submarines once they go underwater. The worst-case scenario for North Korea was that one of them be on patrol somewhere along the North Korean infiltration route. The chance that North Korean submarine being detected could have been still not significant due to the earlier reasons, but it was a chance that North Korea had to take. But at the end, North Korea had the ultimate ace card to play: the strategic advantages of aggressor, meaning that North Korea as an aggressor had the power to decide the very basic elements of battle, including time, manner, and location. This is precisely why North Korea had been able to pull off a significant number of victories over the opponent who had the stronger economy and conventional military power. While the South had to prepare for every possibilities, the North Koreans could observe the South Korean response first, then strike when and where the enemy is most vulnerable. If we build a timeline, the North Korean decision-making over the timing of attack is easily comprehensible. First, there was the Battle of Dacheong-si, which provoked North Korea and made her eager for revenge. And immediately after the battle, the South Koreans expected retaliation and issued high combat readiness to her fleet and sent additional assets to the second fleet to boost their defense. The North Koreans, despite their meager reconnaissance capabilities, were fully aware of this. The South Korean government was disclosing some of their operational details to the media, hoping to deter North Korean actions. It was kind of open warning against the North. The North Korean activation of anti-ship radar sites and a series of verbal provocations that followed gave the South a good reason to keep their guard up. So, to the North Koreans, to attack now was not a viable option. As clear as it sounds, to attack the fully prepared enemy was suicidal. But at the same time, it was also clear that South Korea could not retain the combat readiness for good. When the high combat readiness is issued, every sailor is expected to be in position to do their jobs. The passes and leaves are cancelled, and access to family and means of entertainment is often restricted. Also, because more ships will have to be on patrol for longer days, both the men and ships suffer heavily from fatigue. In a nutshell, it is impossible to run any organization in such state for long. Even if you force it by power and authority, the effectiveness of readiness is greatly reduced as time goes on. It was evident that South Korea will have no choice but to lift the readiness at some point. But when? North Korea knew that the wargame-based military exercise between the United States and Republic of Korea, known as Key Resolve and Full Eagle, had been held every spring. And it was usually followed by varied maritime trainings, including amphibious exercise, anti-submarine exercise, and so on. During this time, much of South Korean naval and anti-submarine capacity was devoted solely to the exercise. So if the South Koreans should lift the combat readiness before next spring, and the US-ROK combined exercise should be held as usual, then it will be the window of opportunity for North Korea to strike the otherwise engaged enemy. Even if the South Koreans should turn out to be extremely stubborn and maintain their readiness until the end of the exercise, North Korea will still have a second chance. Upon their defeat in the First Battle of Yeonpyeong Sea, the North Koreans had waited as many as 3 years to get their revenge. The North had the privilege to choose the timing of attack, and time was on their side. If you recall, the South Korean naval force defending the NLL was divided into two groups: the small patrol boats and the relatively large corvettes and frigates. The nimble and small patrol boats were inadequate targets for the slow and short-ranged North Korean torpedoes. Also, the patrol boats of the western coast of Yeonpyeong Island was inaccessible by submarines. Here, water is dangerously shallow for submarine operation. The more feasible target was corvettes, but they had withdrawn to outside the range of North Korean radar detection, and their exact location was unknown. But since the Battle of Daecheon Sea, the North Koreans had more than enough time to conjecture the new location of the corvettes. Especially, North Korea knew from the past experience that a corvette patrolling off the western coast of Baekneung Island used to hide behind the island whenever North Korea activated anti-ship missile radar. This is where the shadow zone created by the mountainous island exists, and thus safe from North Korean radar detection. The corvette must be sitting here since the North Korea's activation of radar on November 15th. On the other hand, other corvettes must be still patrolling off the western coast of Yeonpyeong Island. In this water, there is no natural shelter against radar detection. Given these target locations, the North Koreans had come up with several possible infiltration routes. The first was to depart from Sak Cape, go through the NLL, and attack a corvette patrolling between Daecheon and Yeonpyeong Island. Crossing the NLL meant that the submarine had to go through the dangerous fishing areas full of Chinese trawlers and fishing nets. The presence of shallow areas will also make the submarine's underwater maneuver unusually difficult. As mentioned, these two were the main environmental difficulties that had heavily impeded both North and South Korean submarine operation in the Yellow Sea. Even if the North Koreans overcame these difficulties and managed to infiltrate undetected, the engagement itself will be a Herculean task. On this open sea with large patrol area, a corvette could fully utilize her mobility. It was a serious challenge to the North Koreans because most of their torpedoes had a short effective range and modest speed. Even the North Korea's recent ambitious work, known as Combined Homing Torpedo, O2 dual plane, had the maximum range up to 8 miles, but its effective range was reduced to only some 1.6 miles, and its speed was less than 40 knots, which was only slightly faster than that of the South Korean vessels. It's clear that it had neither endurance nor speed to outrun most of South Korean warships when their mobility remained unfettered. There was a significant risk at the exfiltration stage as well. If the North Koreans managed to sink the corvette, then the South Korean reinforcement will come from all directions but north, given their fleet placement across the NLL. So the only feasible exfiltration route for the sub was to go back north and return to the North Korean waters, unless they want to take a chance on slipping through the hostile anti-submarine assets just above them. In turn, the South Koreans, upon the news of attack, will surely concentrate their forces on the water between the attack point and the NLL. Whether North Korea will lose the sub en route to the safe area cannot be stated with certainty, because the success of the South Korean retaliation will depend on other important variables, including the South Korean response time and the initial distance between the reinforcement and the interception point. But one thing was for sure, things will go definitely easier for North Korea and hard for South Korea if the South Koreans were incapable of pinpointing the exfiltration route. The second route was to similarly depart from Sak Cape, but this time strike the corvette sitting behind Baekneung Island. This new target seemed more promising because it gave the North Koreans two important tactical advantages. First, the torpedo hit probability was very high. Although sitting behind an island was a good solution to the anti-ship missile threat, it could also make you extremely vulnerable to submarine attack. In the small and narrow patrol area, warships lose their precious mobility and must slow down, and doing so will give submarines, even one with short strike range as the North Korean submarines, enough time and right angle for a perfect shot. Plus, the submarine during her exfiltration will be protected by the presence of multiple exfiltration routes. Baekneung is at once farthest from the South Korean mainland, very close to the North Korean shore, and directly connected to the international water. Its unique geography gave the North Koreans at least 3 exfiltration routes. One was to retrace the infiltration route and go between Baekneung and Daecheon Island. The second was go north, and the last was to go through the high sea. As you probably guessed, the last 2 are the other infiltration routes that I will explain in a moment. Anyway, the presence of these multiple exfiltration routes will greatly enlarge the South Korean search area if they were to look for the submarine for retaliation. And inversely speaking, this increases North Korea's chance of safe exfiltration. However, this plan suffered from the same environmental problems as before, the fishing areas and shallow water. The third way was to depart from Bipa Cape, go directly south, and attack the same corvette. This route could have been slightly better than the previous one in that the submarine didn't have to worry about the shallow water. But there was a trade-off. The water between Baekneung and Jangsang Cape was infamous for strong current, which will pose a severe danger to the submarine's underwater maneuver. All the other characteristics were same as the second plan. The last option was to attack the same target, but through the high sea instead of the NLL. This was the most promising option for the North Koreans. It still had all the tactical advantages of the second and third plans, and the submarine could bypass the Chinese fishing areas on the NLL by taking a detour. In terms of water depths, the international water between Korean Peninsula and China is the deepest area in the Yellow Sea. And because Baekneung is located just next to this high sea, its western water is comparably deep. It means that the submarine could stay in deep water throughout the entire operation, from the infiltration to engagement and exfiltration. This is how North Korea was going to overcome the unfavorable conditions in the Yellow Sea. In summary, the North Koreans had to choose between 4 possible options, which were all different in terms of environmental and tactical aspects. If we skim the pros and cons of each option, it's not hard to imagine which enemy target and infiltration route that the North Koreans had chosen at the end. It was the 4th option, which gave the North Koreans all the tactical advantages and no troubling Yellow Sea problems. By 2009, North Korea had the just submarine up to the task. It was the recently built Miche submarine of some 130 tons, which had also been exported to Iran in 2003. It was named by the US Rogue Intelligence as Yeonha-class submarine, but North Korea introduced it to the international market as MS-29. Due to her small size, she was well suited for the shallow water operation in the Yellow Sea. Perhaps the most noticeable feature of this submarine is the small secondary screw ahead of the main propeller, which enables the submarines to operate in slow speed with little noise. Also, despite the small size, she was capable of carrying 2 heavyweight torpedoes. Most importantly, MS-29 was one of few, if not the only, submarine types in North Korea that had a passive infrared detector. The infrared detector was integral to the North Korean plan, because the attack must occur after nightfall for safe exfiltration. Still, MS-29 had the typical flaws visible in many other North Korean submarines, such as the lack of advanced sonar system, limited underwater endurance, and short strike range. Overall, MS-29 was a never advanced submarine in modern and Western standard. But she was the best submarine that North Korea could offer at the time, and clearly capable of destroying obsolete surface units with little anti-submarine capacity. In winter, the major North Korean ports in the Yellow Sea become inoperable. How the freezing cold had frustrated the North Korean naval operation was vividly captured by NASA's Terra satellite on January 2010. Here, you can see the entire northern coast was completely frozen. Nampo, where the West Fleet headquarters is located, and Bipa Cape, the major North Korean submarine base in the Yellow Sea, were affected by this. Only the port close to the south remained untouched. This time of the year, the major elements of the West Fleet have no choice but to go into hibernation. So from January to February 2010, most surface vessels and submarines were sitting idle in ports, and semi-submersible craft were moved indoors for ice protection. But this hibernation brought about unexpected byproducts. The two South Korean destroyers, which had been patrolling around the NLL to assist the Second Fleet, were no longer visible. The South Koreans must have thought that North Korea would be incapable of conducting naval operations for a while and had lifted the combat readiness. Such judgment itself wasn't wrong. But when the ice began to thaw from the late February, and when North Korea resumed normal operation in the Yellow Sea, the South Koreans still showed no sign of strengthening their combat readiness. As many other countries do, South Korea announced the location and time of their exercise in advance to prevent possible accidents. On March 9, 2010, South Korea announced that the US ROKS Combined Maritime Exercise is scheduled from 23rd to 28th the same month. The closest training area was some 55 miles away from the target. Up to this day, no anti-submarine asset can detect a small diesel-electric submarine from such distance. So, after 4 months from the previous defeat, the North Koreans finally got the perfect opportunity that they wanted. South Korea lowered her guard down and was about to be otherwise engaged. On March 23rd, two Sangho-class submarines departed from Bipa Cape. Their mission was not to engage the enemy, but to deceive them. They will ply between the base and nearby water and radio the base on a frequent basis. If spotted by the US ROKS reconnaissance assets, which was likely given the intelligence asymmetry, it will make them to believe that submarines had no intention of attack and were doing just equipment tests and personnel trainings that North Korea had been doing every spring thaw. On March 24th, or the next day, a submarine tender in Nampo took off. Almost simultaneously, one MS-29 submarine also departed from Bipa Cape. They were moving separately and under the cover of darkness to evade any possible surveillance. They soon met up at the international water a few hours later. The submarine received logistic support from the tender, including fuel and food. When completed, the submarine separated from the tender and kept heading south. The last waypoint was probably reached before the sunrise. The submarine began infiltrating into the South Korean water in slow but steady economic speed. 25th in the afternoon, she arrived at the ambush point, 5 miles southwest of Baekneung Island. Here, the submarine could cover all of target's patrol area with her sonar and still out of the predicted range of the corvette's detection. But the problem was that the corvette, the actual target, was nowhere to be seen. The submarine before departure had been briefed on the possible presence of bad weather around the island based on South Korean weather reports, which could be the reason why the corvette did not show up. The longer the submarine remained undetected, the stronger the South Korean suspicion will grow. In order to avoid it, the operation must be concluded within a few days. 08:30-26, the target appeared. The corvette was moving in slow speed, roughly 4 to 7 knots. She was in a typical zigzag maneuver, rapidly changing her course every 1 to 3 miles. The submarine had several chances for attack before nightfall. Around 1400, 1700, and 1900, the corvette came out to the relatively deeper water and was within the submarine's strike range. Still, the submarine did not engage the target. First, it was not a good angle for a torpedo attack. Then the submarine had to fire at the either approaching or moving away target. The torpedo will most likely explode under the bow or stern of the ship, and damage will be relatively minor. In order to deliver a devastating blow, she must strike from the flank. Then the torpedo will explode under the very center of the ship and completely break her in half. Also, for the safe exfiltration, the submarine had to wait for nightfall. When the submarine was waiting for the H hour, the North Korean coastal batteries were about to carry out the pre-coordinated plan. Around 1900, the guns had come out of the concealed bunker and were left exposed to the eyes of the South Koreans. It was another disinformation campaign to restrain the target's mobility and prevent the corvette from leaving the narrow patrol area behind the island, which will make the submarine's job a lot easier. Although the North Koreans probably hadn't known at the moment, these precautionary efforts didn't really matter because the South Korean High Command had no intention whatsoever to relocate the corvette from the radar shadow zone that they believed safe. Clearly, the South Korean commanders had put the threat of coastal batteries and missiles before that of submarines. Now, the time had come for them to pay for their mistake. From 2000 to 2100, the corvette was staying close to the shore and heading to southeast. At 2110, she made a hard turn to northwest. She was moving in parallel with the shore in slow speed of 6 to 7 knots. She was exposing her vulnerable port side to the submarine. It was the perfect angle of shot that the submarine had been waiting for the entire day. She slowly approached to the target. At 2117, the corvette finally entered into the deeper water. The submarine returned to the periscope depths and confirmed the distance and bearing of the target. The corvette's hull number was visible. It was 772, or the ROKS Cheonan, the ship that had participated in the First Battle of Yeonpyeong Sea and gave humiliating defeat to North Korea 11 years ago. At the distance of 1.6 miles, she fired a heavyweight guided torpedo. It was a perfect shot. The torpedo followed the most distinguishable noise from the ship, her engine noise. And with the magnetic detonator, the torpedo exploded right under her engine room at 2122. The created shockwave and water pillar completely broke the ship in half. The fate of Cheonan after breaking in half was captured by a thermal observation device operated by the South Korean Marines on sentry duty on Baekneung Island. They did miss the moment of explosion, but after having heard the huge sound of explosion, the Marines took 2 minutes and 22 seconds to discover the sinking Cheonan. Here you can see the ship was completely broken into stern and bow section. The relatively small stern part was sinking rapidly, and the bow was halfway capsized, revealing her superstructure. The bow section stayed afloat until the rescue team arrived, but the stern, which was 2/5 the size of the ship, had sunk in just 3 minutes and 20 seconds, greatly contributing to the casualties. Out of 40 deaths whose dead bodies were found, 39 came from the stern section. After having released the first torpedo, the submarine was preparing to launch the second one if the target had not been neutralized by a single shot. But as soon as the complete destruction of the ship was confirmed, she immediately fled in full speed. The submarine was moving away from the South Korean water and heading to west, toward the international water. This was the last vulnerable moment for the North Koreans. The submarine had already used one torpedo, and the single remaining torpedo was all she had to protect herself. Also, because she was moving in full speed, her battery was running out fast. If she had been spotted by the South Korean assets then, she surely would have been sunk to the seafloor. At the end, however, the South Koreans had failed to secure the retribution. Although the South Korean response itself wasn't slow, the attack point and Baeknyo Island were simply too far away. The first South Korean reinforcement was dispatched at 21:31, but managed to arrive some 80 minutes after the attack. By this time, the submarine had already escaped the South Korean area of operation and was sailing in the high sea. The submarine retraced her infiltration route and returned to Nampo 4 days later without a scratch. If we go to the final losses of the attack, it was clear North Korean operational success. From this attack, South Korea lost a 1,000-ton corvette and 46 men. An additional casualty was added during the rescue mission. The South Korean losses in this incident alone were more than 7 times those South Korea had suffered in the all last 3 battles over the NLL. On the other hand, North Korea suffered no damage at all. This material and personal damage that North Korea inflicted to the South were more than enough to completely dwarf their previous defeat 5 months earlier. One of the South Koreans perished on that day was Petty Officer Park Kyung-soo, who had participated in the Second Battle of Yeonpyeong-si 8 years ago and injured by the North Korean fire. His death along with Cheonan testifies the level of mutual hatred and desire for revenge between South and North Korean navies accumulated since 1999. Also, as North Korea predicted, the South Koreans, despite their casualties and the failed retribution against the submarine, chose not to carry out any military retaliation against the North. The North Koreans took this as a sign of weakness and decided to push the South even further. On November 2010, or some 8 months after the sinking of Cheonan, North Korea bombarded a South Korean island with their artillery force. The first strike on the South Korean territory since the ceasefire in 1953. But there was one thing that North Korea did not predict. Initially, North Korea had expected that, if the attack succeeded, then South Korea would not be able to find any hard evidence that connects North Korea to the attack. South Korea may still have been suspicious of the North Korean involvement, but she could have not taken any official action against the North with suspicion alone. North Korea was wrong. The South Koreans and the international investigation team were able to raise the remnants of the North Korean torpedo from the sea floor 51 days after the sinking. It was the irrefutable smoking gun, pinpointing North Korea. Based on this evidence, South Korea later imposed sanctions on the North. Since its invention in 1866, torpedoes have been used by submarines in numerous naval engagements, especially during the First and Second World War. However, they were rarely used after 1945. Also, remnants of torpedoes have rarely been discovered. In the time of war, it is foolish to spend your limited resources in finding the used torpedoes. Therefore, in the naval history, the sinking of Cheonan is recorded as at once the rare torpedo attack since 1945, and even rarer case where remnants of torpedo were actually discovered.